Hi, my name is Tanya, and I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in November of 2021. Multiple sclerosis, also known as MS, is an autoimmune disease, and the immune system basically attacks itself with multiple sclerosis. I want to talk about my MS story because leading up to the diagnosis that I received in November, I was a bit confused about what was going on in my body, was very scared, if I were to be honest, and very confused. And I found comfort in just going to YouTube, like I'm doing now, and listening to MS stories from people because I felt like I could validate the symptoms that I was feeling in my body, and I could learn that indeed there was something going on. I like to look at my own story and see where I was in denial a lot about a lot of the things that I was experiencing, and I also minimized things that I experienced. I don't know if that's kind of something that we do as human beings. We minimize things that go on in our body, kind of a denial process. But at any rate, it all came to a point where I could no longer ignore the symptoms that were going on. So I'll kind of back up in, I would say, the end of August, the 1st of September. I was going through a situation in my body where I had a mammogram done, and the results of that mammogram came back that I needed to proceed forward with an ultrasound and then a biopsy. I was under quite a bit of stress throughout that time frame, just not knowing, leading up to the biopsy, all of the ifs, the questions, all of those things, of course, as you're going through something medical that you do. So I some of the things that I was feeling in my body, some of the things that I was going through, I sort of just chalked it all up to the stress that I was going through with that. I noticed I was very fatigued. I was dealing with a lot of fatigue. Looking back, I was even dealing with a lot of heat sensitivity. So when I would go out and try and do something during the day, as it would be, in that time frame, the end of August, 1st of September, the temperatures would be in the 90s, 100, somewhere around that. I noticed that I would become sluggish and I would become almost panicky and sort of have a loss of thoughts of my cognitive thinking would suffer. I can remember it feeling like at times that I was walking through sand. It would just be so difficult to take a step, to even get the strength to take a step sometimes. And so that's just looking back. Like I said, at the time, I just chalked it all up to being overstressed. So where it basically first began with the symptoms that I noticed, I woke up one morning and I noticed that the outside of my face in this area was tingly. I felt like, and I told myself, well, you probably got toothpaste on your face last night when you were brushing your teeth, and you know how sometimes that makes your skin tingly. I felt like that's probably what I did. So I washed my face really good and went on about my business. I noticed, though, that night I was feeling the same feeling. And, somewhere in my mind, I knew that it was more than just getting something on the exterior of my skin, but I still, I minimized it. that same feeling that I was having on the outside of my face, however, over the days to come, the inside of my mouth and the roof of my mouth was feeling that same tingly, numb feeling. And so I thought, well, I must have like a tooth, something that's messed up in one of my teeth that, would affect that nerve in that place. Still not knowing, anything that connected anything else that was going on with the tiredness or the heat sensitivity. And over the next week or so, the feeling on the outside of my face and the inside of my face began to move up, and I noticed that my right eye was becoming very dry, and it was almost as if the eyelid was loose. It wasn't tight against my eye like the other eye, and it almost seemed like that eye drooped. In fact, my husband did mention that my pupils weren't setting straight, that this one was kind of falling over to the side. My eye was kind of lazy over to the side. So I ended up buying a teardrop camper around the 1st of September. Once I went through the biopsy of my breast, and it came back that I was cancer-free. I celebrated in a way, I felt like I had a new charge on life to go out and enjoy while I could, and it just made me see things so much differently, which is kind of ironic as I proceed through my story with MS and the journey with MS. So I bought the teardrop camper and I went on my first camping trip. And that would have been about mid-September. The heat still bothered me. I still noticed that I had cognitive problems that were kind of coming and going. They weren't there all the time. I began to kind of be unsteady on my feet. And by the end of that camping trip, it turned into almost a vertigo feeling where I became really dizzy, really easy. The numbness was still there in my mouth, the tingling up on the roof of my mouth. I began to get a sensitivity with things that I ate or drank that were hot or cold. Things with the eye that the eyelid felt like it was drooping. I began getting blurry vision in that eye. And so still, I thought to myself, it must be some type of vertigo. You must have vertigo. I looked up some things about vertigo and it talked about being dizzy. And so that's kind of where I went with it. I thought maybe that I had some kind of something wrong with a tooth or something that got a nerve inflamed that caused the vertigo. I mean, it's funny looking back the way you can convince yourself that, this is what's wrong and this is why. And so I had a trip to take to Dallas to pick some family members up from the airport, and that was in October. And leading up to that, about 3 days up to that, I got very panicky about making the trip. I didn't know if I would be able to make the trip because as I was driving, if I looked over toward the right, it would throw me into a pretty serious event of dizziness and where I would sort of, the best way I can describe it, I would lose my center. It would throw me off into almost what I described when I finally did go to the doctor as a tailspin. I would just begin to spin and I couldn't control it internally. And so I went ahead and drove and picked them up and came back. And that never really resolved. The dizziness never resolved, the numbness and tingling. I also felt the numbness and tingling moving kind of down my neck. My neck became numb. And so it wasn't just my mouth, but it was my neck as well. Pins and needles sometimes numbness. And so I know it sounds silly that I didn't go to the doctor, but again, I don't know what it is about us that will minimize something, but I did, obviously. And so I ended up coming back, and a week or so later, taking another camping trip. As I was camping, I noticed that my walking around the campsite, I would almost stumble and fall. My legs became weak. I knew that there was quite a bit of weakness there. And then also the dizziness became really bad, to where if I leaned my body toward the right, if I was stepping around something and I leaned toward the right, then I would almost fall toward the right. I couldn't hardly pick myself back up and straighten myself out. My right eye began having a lot of blurriness in my vision. I couldn't bring things into focus. It was almost like my glasses, although they were only about 8 months old, it was almost like my glasses were the wrong prescription, that I was unable to see out of what I could see out of just a month before, mostly in that right eye. And I began noticing as I was on that camping trip, it was about a week-long trip, I began noticing that I was having a headache, but the headache would predominantly be behind that right eye. I would hurt behind my eye. And so I cut that camping trip short, and I came back home, and I told my husband I should probably just go ahead and go to the doctor tomorrow, because it hasn't cleared up. Now my eye's hurting, and I still didn't connect a lot of these things together. I know that sounds silly, but I didn't. I was just mainly thinking about the things that I couldn't ignore anymore, like my eyesight, the pain I was feeling behind my eye, things like that. So I went to the clinic, to my primary care doctor on the Monday, because this was over a weekend, and the Monday that I went was probably the first or second Monday in October, I would say. And I began explaining to her some of the things that were going on, and giving her the rundown of what had been happening over the last month, as she began to ask for different things in my history. And I can remember a point when she stopped writing, and she said to me, I believe that this is something serious. I want to send you for additional tests. And she said, we don't have MRI here, and so I want to send you over to the hospital where they do have MRI. And I said, okay, no problem. I'll just drive over there. And she said, no, I can't let you drive. And I said, but I just drove here. And she said, but you shouldn't have drove here. She said, I believe that you have one of two things going on. You either have a mass in your brain pressing on specific nerves that are causing these things, or you have MS. And I didn't fully know what MS stood for even. I don't know anybody. I didn't know anybody at the time. I do now, almost a year later, that had MS. So I didn't know a lot about it. I don't know that I knew anything about it other than just that it was called MS. And so I didn't really notice either that as I walked in, and I was walking into the office that my feet were kind of slapping down on the ground, um, because I had a foot drop, and it was on both sides, but mostly on the left side. And which was the side that I was experiencing the weakness and the tingling and stuff on. It would go down my neck and down into this arm. So the ambulance came to pick me up. Of course, I was at the doctor's office alone because I never dreamed it would be something that they would not let me drive back to where I was going at, right? Even though I know I probably shouldn't have been driving, but so the ambulance came and got me and took me over to the hospital. They did the CAT scan. The ER doctor told me basically the same thing that my primary care had told me, that it was going to be one of two things. He knew by reading all of the record that she had wrote that it was probably, to him, in his mind, MS. And so he couldn't get me in for the MRI that day, only the CAT scan. So the CAT scan came back negative for any mass, which I was over the top happy about, because who wants to deal with that? But so then I said, what do you think it is? Do you think it's just vertigo or maybe a nerve? And he said, no, I really think it's MS. And he said, it's pretty classic for MS. And so, excuse me. So he scheduled me about a week out for an MRI. That was as soon as they could get me in. They were having a lot of COVID cases and stuff then, so they kind of had some scheduling problems. And so it was about a week away. And so I went for an MRI of my brain, and in the MRI, I'm kind of fast forwarding because once I had it done, it took me probably another week and a half to 2 weeks to get in with the neurologist, which was really pretty fast because the day that my primary care saw me, she actually wrote a referral for me to see the neurologist that day. So in total, I was in the neurologist's office within a month and a half, which was, you just don't hear of that. It was really fast. And so when I got to my neurologist appointment, he was able to look at the MRI that the ER doctor had ordered, and it did show quite a few lesions in my brain, but that didn't really, the places that they were in my brain didn't really explain why I was losing function in my arms and legs, why it was affecting my limbs. And so he ordered an additional MRI of my brainstem. I was actually able to go get that day that I was in his office. And so I went down and got that. He saw me about a week later and gave me the news that there were lesions as well in my brainstem. The ones in my brainstem affected my gait, my being able to walk steady, different things like that. So kind of explained some of the things that were going on a little bit better. He put me on Aubagio, and I began taking it then. And so some time went on. I had hoped that the Aubagio would work. As time went on, though, I didn't seem to get any better. I was only progressing worse. He had diagnosed me with RRMS that day, the day that he had seen me. But as things progressed, I believe it was in December, the end of December, I got COVID. And when I got COVID, as you can imagine, it exacerbated a lot of things. things broke down worse than what they were. I pretty much was bedridden for close to 2 months, unless someone was on the side of me helping me, or in the front of me helping me get from the bed to the bathroom. I couldn't take a shower by myself. Things pretty much just quit working, and I began having bladder issues. Just a lot of things went from bad to way worse. So I went back to my neurologist and saw him. He did an additional MRI. He told me that, that day that he saw me, he said, I had originally thought that you had RRMS and that the Aubagio would be well tolerated, that it would control the symptoms, it would control the progression of the disease. But he said it hasn't. And so we need to go with a stronger medication. And so he actually put me on Tysabri, and I hope I'm saying that right. I'm actually have not started it yet. In between, he had to get it approved on the formulary there. So in between the medication change, he gave me Copaxone injections, daily injections to take. So I'm awaiting the infusion. I'm awaiting the Tysabri, and but those are the 3 medications that I've been on so far. After getting COVID, I know your baseline, if you know about the way MS works, if you have a virus or you have an illness or something that comes along that knocks you back down, your disabilities may be at a baseline here, and you may, after you get well, you may regain all of your movements, regain everything in your abilities as you had before at that baseline. But you may not. You may only regain, say, 80% back. So after having the COVID virus, I did not gain everything back. My walking has not gotten much better. It has got a little better. There was a time after getting COVID that once I was able to get up out of the bed and move by myself, I had to go from that to a cane, and that was the only way that I could get around. Since then, I have not used the cane, which is a good thing. But my gait and my legs, I'm pretty much numb down the fronts of my legs. I feel some in the back upper legs. My feet are numb and tingling. I don't feel a lot in my legs or my feet. My fatigue is still very great. I get fatigued very quickly, and my heat sensitivity is still pretty much, if I'm out in the heat, I've got to be in the shade, and I can't stand that very long. If I do that, I deal with a lot worse fatigue. So after getting COVID and getting a little bit better, I feel like my baseline didn't completely go back to what I was prior COVID, but it didn't drop down as much as it has recently. I actually got COVID again. It's probably been about 2 weeks ago. So I went to an event where there were a lot of people, and I came back and I was feeling pretty fatigued and felt fevery. And so I, of course, went for the COVID test because I was sneezing and coughing, doing some things like that. And of course it was positive. So that was another time of having COVID. I have noticed that I feel very tired. I wear out pretty quick, and some cognitive, I have a lot of cognitive things going on, which I had before, but I feel them more so than I did before. I will also say that something I left out in December after getting COVID the first time. It was shortly after that I got occipital neuralgia, I think is what it's called. I was having the pain behind my eye, and it just set into the back of my head, and it was just severe pain. Probably the worst pain of a headache of any kind that I've ever felt. And so my neurologist went in and did a nerve block into the occipital nerve, and I hope I'm getting that right, but I believe that's where it was at. And he said he could do one every 30 days if he needed to, if that flared back up again. But so I'm awaiting, I'm awaiting, as I said, the Tysabri, and I'm hoping that works well, that it does slow the progression. I'm learning more and more about this all the time. So I feel like knowledge is power. Without it, if you don't educate yourself on some of the things that are going on, you feel helpless. You feel like, MS has control of you. And to some extent, MS is a chronic disease that progresses. And so, to some extent that is true, but we have to be proactive for ourselves and not minimize what is there, as I did in the beginning. And so, I'm hoping for the best with the infusion, and waiting to hear back from my neurologist as to when we're going to start those. I believe it will probably be within the next week, couple of weeks. I feel like it'll be pretty quick, but I will give you an update again once I've had that first infusion and how I feel and the things, as I said, these videos helped me when I was trying to figure out what was wrong. And it was no fun getting a diagnosis of MS, but I will say that it did validate some of the things that I was feeling in my body. And looking back now, when the good thing is I didn't have to have, I think is it a spinal tap that they do? I didn't have to have that. And I'm grateful that I didn't have to have that, but they saw enough lesions on the MRI that they didn't need to do that because it was obvious. But even looking back in the history, when they went back and did the history, they believed that MS had been prevalent in my body since probably around the last 10 years. I had mono as a child, and they don't know exactly what causes MS, but they have found that, I think I want to say this right too, everyone who has MS has had mono, but not everyone who has mono will get MS. That's just some studies that they look at, like low vitamin D. If you've ever had the is it Epstein-Barr virus? I hope I said that right too. But so, a lot of the problems that I had that I chalked up to just having back problems, like I'd had 2 or 3 back surgeries throughout 2015 on. Some of the things that I was feeling in my body and that I was going through in my body could have been MS. I dealt with some drop foot back then, different things. And so they really do kind of mimic one another. Also, I went on a trip, it's probably been about a month ago. maybe a month and a half to Dallas with my husband. He had some training up there, and we walked probably, the restaurant that we were going to was probably about maybe 11 minutes from our hotel room. And it was pretty hot that day. I was in the shade, but we were in all of the buildings downtown, in the shadow of the buildings. And so the sun wasn't directly hitting me, but neither was the wind, because the buildings were quite a wind block. I did notice that you never want to see how far you can push your body and what it does. But it did show me limitations. It showed me what not to do in the future. I'll say that, because my body overheated to the point to where my legs would not work anymore. He actually had to pick me up on his back and carry me a couple of city blocks to set me down on a bench, because I wasn't able to. I could think, and that is the strangest thing. I could think the thought for my legs to move, that they needed to move, that I needed to take the step. But although I thought that thought, they wouldn't move. They wouldn't take the step. My feet, they drug. Like, the best I could do was drag my toes across the ground, and I couldn't pick my feet up completely. So, you never want to see how bad that will get, but if it will prevent you from doing something in the future that could cause you harm, or I wouldn't want to be downtown any big city by myself and walk too far and end up in that position. Thank goodness I had someone there that could take me and carry me to a place and set me down and call a taxi. So I said all that to say, I do know my limitations, and I listen to my body, where before I wouldn't listen to my body. But I know that I have to listen to my body, because it knows how far it can go. It knows the things that sometimes I want to push past. But thank you guys for listening to all of this today. And I know it's just a rough draft, a talk. I just kind of went into it. I've been meaning to do this for probably the last 8 months, but I wanted to wait until I got to a place where I could just talk about everything. In the beginning, I would say that you're pretty emotionally raw. You're pretty emotionally triggered by words, by terms, by even the diagnosis. You don't want to accept it. It's very scary at first. So if you're experiencing all of that, and you're at the place that I was when I first heard the diagnosis, and I went to YouTube to watch things and learn things and understand things so that I would know what was going on in me. I hope this helps in some way. As far as my mobility, I can walk better than I can't use my hands very well. If I can't use, like, cut my own steaks up or cut anything, like any fine motor skills is just not there. I'm hoping that after I begin the infusions that they will better. I will come up to a higher baseline. That's what my hopes are. I hope that happens. And again, thank you for listening, and I will update this as soon as I begin those infusions and I know something more. Thank you, guys.